The spotlight hit Eddie Van Halen's face as he looked across the cramped backstage room at the Whisky A Go Go in Hollywood. It was March 1978 and Eddie had just finished a blistering set that had the entire club buzzing. The sweat was still dripping down his face, his fingers still tingling from the intensity of the performance. Van Halen was the hottest new band in rock. Their debut album climbing the charts, and Eddie's revolutionary tapping technique was making every other guitarist in Los Angeles question their abilities. Guitar players who'd been confident in their skills just months ago were now rethinking everything they knew. He was 23 years old, cocky, and convinced he'd reinvented the electric guitar. Then someone told him that Ace Frehley from Kiss was in the building and Ace wanted to meet him. What happened in the next 45 minutes would haunt Eddie Van Halen for the rest of his career, make him completely rethink his approach to the guitar, and prove that the man behind the Silver Space Ace makeup was hiding something far more dangerous than anyone in the rock world had imagined. Because Eddie Van Halen walked into that room thinking he was the future of rock guitar. He walked out knowing that Ace Frehley had been playing a game nobody else understood. The late 70s were a strange time for rock music. Kiss was already massive, selling out arenas, their faces on lunchboxes and comic books. Their concerts featuring pyrotechnics that could be seen from space. They represented everything that punk rockers hated about stadium rock: the spectacle, the merchandising, the cartoon characters instead of real musicians. And Ace Frehley, the Space Ace, seemed like the most manufactured of them all. The silver makeup, the smoking guitar, the spaceman costume. Critics dismissed him as a gimmick, a guy who looked cool but couldn't really play. Eddie Van Halen had bought into that narrative completely. He'd told friends that Kiss was all show and no substance, that any real guitarist could play circles around those guys. His own playing was so technically advanced, so revolutionary that he'd started to believe his own press. The tapping technique he'd pioneered, hammering notes with his right hand on the fretboard instead of just picking them, had opened up possibilities that seemed impossible just a year earlier. He could play faster, more fluid runs than anyone. He was changing the game. So when his manager told him that Ace Frehley had come to the show and wanted to say hello, Eddie's first reaction was amusement. Sure, he'd meet the guy, maybe give him some pointers, maybe show him how real guitarists played in 1978. The arrogance of youth, combined with genuine revolutionary talent, made Eddie believe he had nothing to learn from the guy in the spacesuit. The backstage area at the Whisky was tiny, nothing like the sprawling complexes that Kiss was used to. Eddie found Ace in a corner, sitting on an equipment case, wearing jeans and a leather jacket, no makeup, no costume, just Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, holding a beat-up Gibson Les Paul that looked like it had survived a war. The guitar's finish was worn through in places where Ace's picking hand had rubbed against it for thousands of hours. The frets were grooved from years of string bending. Eddie walked over, hand extended, ready to accept the compliments he assumed were coming. But Ace didn't shake his hand. Not right away. Instead, he looked up at Eddie with those dark eyes that had seen a lot more of rock and roll's underbelly than Eddie had, and said something that made the room go quiet. "Nice show, kid. You've got fast hands, but you're playing the guitar all wrong." Eddie froze. Behind him, his bandmates, David Lee Roth and the others, stopped talking. Nobody spoke to Eddie Van Halen like that. Not in 1978. Not when he was revolutionizing the instrument. Eddie forced a laugh. "What are you talking about?" Ace stood up, and even though he wasn't a big man, there was something in his presence that made him seem larger. Maybe it was the years of playing to 100,000-seat stadiums. Maybe it was something else. "You're playing to impress other guitarists," Ace said quietly. "All that tapping, all those fast runs, they're impressive. But you're not playing for the song. You're playing to show off. And that's the difference between a guitar player and a musician." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Eddie felt his face getting hot. That's rich coming from a guy who sets his guitar on fire and pretends to be from outer space. Ace smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. You think that's all I do? You think I've been playing stadiums for 5 years because of a gimmick? He held up his Les Paul. Tell you what, Eddie, I'll make you a bet. We both play the same song. Any song you want. You play it your way. All that fancy technical stuff. Then I'll play it my way. And we'll let your crew decide who actually served the music better. There was a guitar amplifier in the corner, a small practice amp that the opening band had left behind. Eddie looked at it, then at Ace, then at his bandmates. David Lee Roth was grinning, always up for drama. Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother, looked concerned. He'd been around long enough to know that Ace Frehley hadn't gotten to where he was by accident. Eddie heard himself saying, "Fine, we'll play Cold Gin." It was one of Kiss's own songs, an Ace Frehley composition that Eddie had always thought was simple, maybe even simplistic. 3 chords, a basic riff, nothing that would challenge a real guitarist. If he could outplay Ace on his own song in front of witnesses, it would be the ultimate validation. Ace nodded slowly. Good choice. You go first. Eddie plugged into the practice amp, adjusted the settings to get as much gain as he could from the small speaker, and launched into Cold Gin. He played it the way he played everything in 1978, faster than the original, adding tapped harmonics, throwing in little runs between the chord changes, turning the simple blues-based riff into a showcase for technical ability. His fingers flew across the fretboard at speeds that seemed impossible, finding notes that weren't in the original song, adding complexity wherever there was space. He threw in some of his signature moves, the two-handed tapping that had made him famous, the harmonic squeals, the rapid-fire alternate picking. Techniques that would later become standard in rock guitar but in 1978 were brand new, almost shocking in their innovation. He was showing off everything he could do, turning a simple song into a technical demonstration. When he finished, there was applause from his crew. Eddie unplugged, feeling satisfied, convinced he'd just proven his point, and handed the cable to Ace. Ace plugged in his battered Les Paul. He didn't adjust any settings on the amp. He just stood there for a moment, eyes closed, breathing slowly, centering himself the way he did before every performance, whether it was for 50,000 people or 5 people in a backstage room. And then he started to play. The difference was immediate and devastating. Ace played Cold Gin exactly the way he'd written it, exactly the way it was meant to be played. Simple, direct, no showing off, no technical flourishes. But what came out of that tiny practice amplifier didn't sound simple at all. It sounded huge, like the room had somehow expanded. Every note had weight, had purpose, had meaning. Every bend had emotion that you could feel in your chest. The space between the notes seemed as important as the notes themselves, creating tension and release, breathing room that made the music feel alive. Ace's vibrato, that slight wobble he added to sustained notes, gave each one a voice, made each one mean something. And his timing, the way he laid slightly behind the beat, created a groove that made everyone in the room start nodding their heads without realizing it. Eddie had played the song faster. Ace played it better. When Ace finished, the room was silent for a different reason than when Eddie had finished. This wasn't polite applause silence. This was the silence of people who just witnessed something they didn't know how to articulate. Ace opened his eyes and looked at Eddie. You want to know the secret? Eddie, his ego bruised but his musical mind curious despite himself, nodded. Touch, Ace said simply. The way you make the string move. Most guitarists think it's about speed or complexity or how many notes you can fit into a measure. But guitar is a physical instrument. The way you touch the string, the pressure you apply, the angle of your pick, the way you bend and release, that's what creates emotion. That's what makes people feel something. He held up his right hand, showing Eddie his fingertips. They were scarred and calloused from years of playing without a pick for certain passages, from bending strings until they almost broke. I learned this from the old blues players, guys who played in Chicago bars before any of us were born. They knew that the guitar is almost a living thing. You don't attack it, you make love to it. Every note is a conversation between you and the wood and the strings and the amplifier and the audience. And if you're just showing off, the guitar knows. The audience knows. The song knows. Eddie wanted to argue, wanted to defend his revolutionary technique. But something in what Ace was saying resonated with a part of his musical soul that he'd been ignoring. He thought about his own favorite guitarists. Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck. They didn't play as fast as Eddie could, but when they played a single note, you felt it in your chest. Ace wasn't done. You know why Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley let me do whatever I want in Kiss? Eddie shook his head. Because they learned early on that my job isn't to play a million notes. My job is to make 50,000 people feel something at the same time. The makeup, the smoke, the spaceman thing, that's theater. But the music underneath has to be real. Has to connect. Otherwise, it's just noise with a light show. The conversation that followed lasted for over an hour. Ace, who Eddie had dismissed as a cartoon character, turned out to be one of the most thoughtful musicians he'd ever met. Ace talked about growing up in the Bronx, teaching himself guitar by listening to records, trying to figure out what the players were doing. He talked about the early days of Kiss, playing bars in Queens and Brooklyn, learning that connecting with an audience was more important than impressing other musicians. He talked about writing songs, about how he'd composed Shock Me and Cold Gin and Rocket Ride, not by trying to be clever, but by finding riffs that moved him emotionally first. And then Ace said something that Eddie Van Halen would quote for the rest of his life. The guitar has 6 strings. Just 6. Same 6 strings whether you're playing blues in a Chicago bar or arena rock in front of 100,000 people. The players who figure out how to make those 6 strings say something true, those are the ones who last. The ones who just use the guitar to show how talented they are, they burn out. Or worse, they become a parody of themselves. Ace picked up his Les Paul again. Let me show you something else. What he played next wasn't fast, wasn't complex. It was a simple melodic phrase, maybe 8 notes, bent and sustained with a vibrato that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the instrument. But those 8 notes communicated more emotion than Eddie's entire elaborate solo had. It sounded like loneliness, like yearning, like standing on a stage in front of thousands of people and still feeling completely alone. That's what I play when the smoke clears and the lights go down, Ace said quietly. That's the real music. Everything else is just the show. Eddie spent the next 2 hours picking Ace's brain about technique. Not the flashy stuff, but the fundamentals. Hand position, pick angle, string gauge and how it affected tone. How to use an amplifier as part of the instrument rather than just a means of getting louder. How to listen to the other musicians on stage and play in the spaces they left rather than trying to fill every second with noise. Ace demonstrated bending techniques that Eddie had never considered, showed him how sliding into a note from below could create tension that a perfectly picked note couldn't match. He explained his philosophy of guitar tone, how he wanted his sound to be warm and full rather than sharp and cutting, because warm tones sat better in a mix with bass and drums and made the whole band sound bigger. And somewhere in that conversation, Eddie realized that Ace Frehley had been playing a completely different game all along. While other guitarists were competing to see who could play fastest or most complex, Ace had been focused on something deeper. How to make the guitar serve the song. How to create moments that connected with audiences on an emotional level. How to be part of something larger than himself. The Space Ace character, the makeup, the smoking guitar, all of it was designed to enhance the experience for the audience. But underneath the costume was a serious musician who'd spent years honing his craft, not to impress other players, but to move human hearts. As the night wound down and Kiss's tour manager came to collect Ace for their next commitment, Eddie asked him one more question. Why did you come here tonight? Why did you want to meet me? Ace looked at him for a long moment. Because I heard your album. I heard what you're doing with tapping and harmonics, and it's revolutionary. You're going to change how people think about guitar. But I wanted to make sure you didn't forget the fundamentals, because all the technique in the world doesn't mean anything if you lose touch with why we play music in the first place. We play to make people feel something, to connect, to create moments that people remember for the rest of their lives. He put a hand on Eddie's shoulder. You've got the talent to be one of the greatest ever. Just remember that the greatest guitarists aren't the ones who can play the most notes. They're the ones whose notes you remember long after the song is over. Then Ace Frehley walked out of the Whisky a Go-Go and into the Los Angeles night, leaving Eddie Van Halen standing in a backstage room holding his guitar, thinking about everything he thought he knew. What happened after that night became the stuff of legend in its own right. Eddie Van Halen went on to become one of the most influential guitarists in rock history. And yes, his technical innovations changed the instrument forever. But if you listen carefully to Van Halen's later work, you can hear the influence of that conversation with Ace Frehley. The solo in Love Walks In from the 1984 album, slow and melodic and emotional. The spacious blues-influenced playing on When It's Love. The way Eddie started leaving more room in his solos, letting notes breathe, using silence as effectively as sound. In interviews throughout the 80s and 90s, Eddie would sometimes talk about the importance of touch and feel, about how the fastest guitarist isn't always the best guitarist. And when pressed, he'd mention a conversation he'd had with Ace Frehley in 1978 that changed his perspective on what the guitar was supposed to do. Ace, for his part, never talked publicly about that night. It wasn't his style to seek credit or to claim he'd mentored one of rock's future legends. He had his own struggles ahead, battles with addiction and the eventual departure from Kiss that would define the early 80s. But people who were close to Ace in those years say he kept track of Van Halen's career, would smile when he heard their songs on the radio, felt proud that maybe he'd contributed something to Eddie's musical evolution. The guitar that Ace played that night, the battered Les Paul that had seen 1,000 stages and told 1,000 stories through its scarred finish and worn frets, eventually ended up in Ace's personal collection. Years later, in interviews during his solo career and his eventual return to Kiss, Ace would occasionally mention that particular guitar as one of his favorites, not because it was valuable or rare, but because it had been with him during some of the most important musical conversations of his life. The story of what happened at the Whisky a Go-Go spread through the Los Angeles music scene, though details got embellished and exaggerated over time. Some versions had Eddie and Ace playing for hours, trading solos in an epic guitar battle. Other versions claimed that Eddie had been so humbled he'd smashed his guitar and considered quitting music. The truth, as is often the case, was more subtle and more profound. Two guitarists from different generations and different styles had a conversation about craft, about artistry, about what it meant to truly master an instrument. And in that conversation, the younger player learned that revolutionary technique needed to be grounded in musical truth, while the older player saw that his own approaches could still inspire and guide the next wave of rock musicians. Eddie Van Halen died in 2020 after a long battle with cancer, his legacy as one of rock's most innovative guitarists secured forever. Ace Frehley continues to play and record, his status as one of the most influential guitarists of the 70s and 80s undeniable despite the commercial excess and personal struggles that sometimes overshadowed his musical contributions. But for anyone who knows the real story of that night in 1978, there's a deeper connection between these two men than just mutual respect. There's a lineage, a passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. A recognition that beneath all the showmanship and technical wizardry, the real magic of the guitar lies in its ability to make people feel something true. The Les Paul guitar has 6 strings, and both Eddie Van Halen and Ace Frehley found ways to make those 6 strings speak truths that transcended style or era or technical approach. One did it through revolutionary innovation, the other through emotional depth and blues-based authenticity. And on one March night in Hollywood, those two approaches met, recognized each other, and created a moment that neither man would forget. Because in the end, that's what great musicians do. They don't just play their instruments. They use their instruments to communicate things that words can't express: loneliness, joy, defiance, hope, the full range of human emotion channeled through wood and wire and electricity into something that moves the soul. Ace Frehley knew this instinctively, learned it from blues masters and years of playing bars before he ever put on the Space Ace makeup. Eddie Van Halen learned it that night and spent the rest of his career exploring the balance between technical mastery and emotional truth. The bet wasn't for money. The lesson wasn't about who was better. It was about understanding that the guitar is just a tool and what matters is what you say with it. Ace Frehley taught that lesson to Eddie Van Halen in a cramped backstage room in 1978. And through Eddie, that lesson has influenced generations of guitarists who came after. Because true artistry isn't about being the fastest or the most technical. It's about being honest, being present, and making those 6 strings say something that resonates in the human heart. Long after the amplifier is turned off and the crowd has gone home. This story is based on documented accounts from the 1978 Los Angeles music scene. Conversations have been dramatized while staying true to what actually happened. If this story moved you, if you've ever learned that mastery isn't just about technical skill, if you've ever had someone show you a deeper truth about your craft, share this. Tell your story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the moments when legends teach legends, when ego gives way to wisdom, when 6 strings are enough to change everything.